I never expected a routine walk near my office to turn into a conversation that stayed with me for years. When my neighbor's son stopped me that afternoon and spoke with the honesty I wasn't prepared for, it set something quietly powerful in motion. What he said challenged how I saw myself, my past, and the careful walls I had built. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. What city or state are you joining us from today? And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It truly helps more than you know. Now, let me tell you what happened. I still remember the sound of the traffic that afternoon, the low, steady hum of engines rolling past the office park as the day leaned toward evening. I had stayed later than usual, mostly to avoid the quiet of my house. Some days, silence feels heavier than noise. I had my coat over my arm, my mind already halfway home, when I heard my name spoken in a voice I recognized but didn't expect to hear there. I turned a little startled, and there he was. Daniel, my neighbor's son. I had known him for years, of course. I'd watched him grow from a lanky teenager who mowed lawns in the summer into a composed man with a steady gaze and an easy way of standing, like he knew who he was. We'd exchanged polite greetings over fences and during holidays, nothing more. Seeing him near my office, several neighborhoods away from where either of us lived, felt like a wrinkle in the day I hadn't planned for. "I hope this isn't strange," he said, offering a small, careful smile. "I work nearby now. Saw you coming out and thought I'd say hello." His tone was respectful, unassuming. I remember noticing how he kept a comfortable distance, hands visible, posture open. It put me at ease in a way I hadn't realized I needed. We started walking in the same direction without really deciding to. The sidewalk was lined with bare trees, their branches tracing delicate patterns against the pale sky. I could smell coffee from a cafe down the block and the faint scent of rain that never quite arrived. We talked about ordinary things at first. Work, the neighborhood, how much had changed and how much somehow stayed the same. Then, just as we reached the corner where our paths would naturally separate, he slowed and looked at me more seriously. "There's something I've wanted to tell you," he said. "Not today specifically, just for a while." I felt a quiet tightening in my chest, not fear, but awareness. I nodded, giving him space to continue. "When my father passed," he said, "you were one of the first people who checked on my mother. You didn't make a big show of it. You just showed up. I was younger then, but I noticed. I've carried that with me." His words landed softly, but they carried weight. I hadn't thought much of those days. You do what you can when someone is hurting. Still, hearing it reflected back made me see that version of myself more clearly. He went on, choosing his words with care. "You always seemed like someone who listened. Not just to respond, but to understand. I guess I wanted you to know that it mattered." For a moment, the noise of the street faded. I felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with appearances or roles, just presence. I thanked him, probably more quietly than I meant to. We stood there, the space between us filled with something gentle and unspoken. Not expectation, not pressure, just recognition. When we finally parted ways, I continued toward my car, but I moved more slowly. His words echoed, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. That night, as I sat alone with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, I realized something had shifted. Not in my circumstances, but in my awareness. Sometimes it isn't a grand event that changes you. Sometimes it's a simple conversation near an office building, on an ordinary afternoon, with someone who surprises you by speaking from the heart. The days after that conversation passed more slowly than usual. I found myself replaying it while waiting at stoplights or folding laundry, not because I was searching for hidden meaning, but because it had stirred something thoughtful in me. At my age, surprises tend to be practical ones, a bill you forgot or a friend who moves away. This had been different. It felt personal in a way that was neither demanding nor uncomfortable. A week later, I saw Daniel again, this time back in the neighborhood. I was tending to the small patch of flowers by my front steps, more for the routine than the result, when he walked by with his mother's old dog. The dog moved slower now, nose low to the ground, as if the world required closer inspection these days. I understood that feeling. "Good afternoon," he said, stopping at the edge of the sidewalk. "How have you been?" There was something warmer in his voice than before, not familiarity exactly, but ease. We talked about the dog, about the weather turning cooler earlier than expected. Ordinary words, yet I noticed how present he was, how he listened without glancing away or rushing the moment along. He mentioned he'd taken a position closer to the city center, a job that challenged him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "It's strange," he said. "You work hard to reach a goal, and then once you're there, you realize the real work is figuring out who you are when you're standing still." That thought stayed with me. I told him I understood more than he might think. I spoke about my own years of balancing responsibility with ambition, how certain dreams get reshaped rather than abandoned. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix anything. He just nodded, eyes steady, as if each word mattered. Before leaving, he asked if I'd like to walk sometime, maybe on one of the trails near the park. "No pressure," he added quickly. "Just conversation." I appreciated that he said it that way. No assumption. No expectation. I agreed, surprised by how natural it felt to do so. We met the following Saturday morning. The park was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles when people haven't fully woken up to the day yet. Leaves crunched underfoot, and the air carried that clean, honest chill that makes you breathe deeper without realizing it. As we walked, our conversation moved gently between past and present. He spoke about his father with a calm acceptance that told me time had done its slow, necessary work. I shared stories of my own parents, how their lessons had revealed themselves more clearly as I aged. At one point, we stopped near the edge of the pond. The water reflected the sky in a muted silver, broken only by the steady movement of ducks gliding across the surface. Daniel rested his hands on the railing, thoughtful. "I've been trying to learn how to be more open," he said. Not louder, just more honest. I felt the truth of that sentence settle between us. I told him that honesty doesn't always arrive early in life, that sometimes it waits until you've learned how to carry it without fear. He looked at me then, really looked, and smiled in a way that felt grateful rather than curious. There was no rush to leave after that. We stood quietly, sharing the view, each of us alone with our thoughts, yet not lonely. When we eventually walked back, I realized I felt lighter. Not because something new had begun, but because something familiar had been named. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the neighborhood lights flickered on, I reflected on how connection doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives softly, in shared steps and unguarded words, asking only that you pay attention. After that morning at the park, something gentle settled into my routine. Not a disruption, more like a new rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. Daniel and I didn't suddenly become fixtures in each other's days. There were no constant messages or expectations. What we shared was quieter than that, and perhaps because of that, it felt more real. We crossed paths every so often, sometimes by design, sometimes by chance. A nod across the street. A few words exchanged near the mailbox. Each time, there was an unspoken understanding that neither of us needed to rush the moment. At this stage of my life, I valued that more than anything. One afternoon, he suggested coffee near my office, the same area where he'd first surprised me with his words weeks earlier. I hesitated for only a moment before agreeing, not because I felt uncertain, but because I was aware. Awareness has a way of slowing you down, making you consider the shape of your choices. The cafe was modest, with worn wooden tables and a window that caught the afternoon sun just right. We sat across from each other, steam rising from our cups, the background noise soft enough to let conversation breathe. He spoke about his work, how leadership didn't always look like authority, how listening often mattered more than speaking. I found myself smiling, recognizing lessons it had taken me decades to fully accept. When it was my turn, I spoke honestly about where I was in life, about learning to be comfortable with my own company, and how strength sometimes means allowing yourself to be seen without armor. He listened the same way he always did, fully, without judgment. At one point, he said something that surprised me again. "You've lived," he said simply, "and you didn't harden because of it." The words caught me off guard. I had thought of myself as careful, perhaps even reserved. I hadn't considered that softness could be something earned rather than lost. We talked about respect, about how meaningful connections don't need labels to be valid. He was clear in his intentions, not in terms of direction, but in values. Mutual regard, honesty, space to grow independently. I appreciated that clarity more than grand promises. As we left the cafe, the sky had shifted to that late-day blue that feels almost reflective. We walked a short distance together, then paused near my car. There was no awkwardness, no sense of something unresolved. Just a shared understanding that whatever this was, it would move at the pace of comfort. That night, I sat by my living room window, watching the streetlights glow one by one. I thought about how connection evolves as we age, how it becomes less about filling emptiness and more about recognizing fullness in another person. I wasn't stepping into something unknown. I was stepping into myself with clearer eyes and a steadier heart, and for the first time in a long while, that felt more than enough. Time has a way of smoothing the edges of things, and as weeks turned into months, what Daniel and I shared found its own steady shape. There was no defining moment that announced a change. Instead, there were small, meaningful choices made again and again. A walk instead of a phone call, a conversation instead of an